Good morning, everyone. This is John Shaw, the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute at SIU Carbondale. Thanks for joining another installment of our series, Illinois Authors. And we're really delighted to be joined today by one of the wise people in American politics and government, Jim Nowlan. Jim is from Nowlan, Illinois, went to the University of Illinois as an undergrad and graduate, got his doctorate there. Has had this wonderfully rich and interesting and diverse career. He's been a professor, a state legislator, a cabinet agency director. He's been an aide to 3 governors. He's been a campaign manager for a U.S. Senate race and also a presidential race. He's been head of a trade association, and he's a prolific author. He's written hundreds of really wonderfully thoughtful essays about Illinois politics and government, and also is also the author or co-author of 8 books. And I have a special shelf in my bookcase for Jim Nowlan books, and I want to go through them. We're going to spend most of our time today talking about his new book that just came out called Politics, the Starter Kit. Very interesting. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. Some years ago, he's written a book, it was about 8 years ago, called Fixing Illinois. Really interesting and provocative. I use it a lot for my work. Has written a book called Illinois Politics, A Citizen's Guide. And Jim and some of his co-authors are going to be updating this book later this year. It's out by University of Illinois Press. And I also have a book of his. It's a novel called The Editor's Wife, One Woman's Political Climb to the Top. I have to confess, I haven't read this, but I have a couple train trips coming up this fall to Chicago, and I can't think of a better way to go up the state of Illinois than reading Jim Nowlan's novel about Illinois politics. So we're really delighted that he's joining us. He's joining us from his home in Princeton, Illinois. So Jim, good morning.
Good to be with you, Jack. You forgot to mention I'm also a notary public.
Okay, I forgot that. We'll edit this tape and include that so it's totally full and comprehensive. Well, Jim, in your book, you one of your opening scenes is you are 18 or 19 years old, a freshman at U of I, and you're in a ballroom in Peoria, Illinois. One of a delegate from Stark County. You're part of a convention of about 30 counties, I think. And you have the temerity to cast the vote for Stark County for the Republican nominee for Supreme Court seat, as I recall. Tell us about how you ended up in that ballroom at the age of 18 or 19. Is this, was politics something that was an early fascination? Was it something your folks encouraged? How did you get to the ballrooms at such a tender age?
As with many in politics, it comes from family and connections. My uncle was a state legislator. My grandfather was a House member during the Depression. And so you come to know the county chairs and they come to know you. And so I was asked to be a part of this delegation. The county chair thought it'd be interesting for me. And obviously it was fascinating to be there, taking public action about an important office. At that time, judges were selected in conventions in Illinois, and that's what I was a part of. And it was exciting, and it hooked me on politics.
No, you studied political science at Illinois, both I think as an undergrad. I mean, I know as an undergrad, a grad, and Ph.D. Was it just this kind of ever deepening interest? Did you have particular professors who really were particularly compelling? Were there courses that really kind of captured your attention? Talk about just briefly how your kind of academic interest in politics evolved.
I started out with an interest in journalism because Dad ran the County Seat Weekly newspaper. And then I took a course in Lincoln Hall at the U of I in what for most people would be boring, and that was local government in America. And it was taught by a delightful fellow named Clyde Snyder, and it was straightforward and not exciting. But for some reason, I became fascinated by what townships do and don't do, and cities and so on. And one good course leads to others.
Interesting. Well, then you graduated from U of I, and at the age of early 20s, you actually ran for state rep. You lost narrowly and then ran again 2 years later and won, and that kind of began your elected career. But just we could spend the whole session talking about your career because it's so rich and interesting. But the thing that as I've come to know you is that One of the features of our political system is just its fluidity, that people can move from government to politics to journalism to academics to business. And you seem to be kind of an exemplar of that, just kind of this wonderful blended career. To what extent was it kind of your intention, or was it just responding to opportunities and kind of openings as they came up?
I often say that whenever I was kicked out of government, I took refuge at the University of Illinois. And so I was back and forth teaching at Knox and the U of I. I was frequently kicked out of government and politics. So it might, I don't know, it wasn't serendipitous. It was the fact that I wasn't really driven to any one particular field, but all of what I've done, and I've had lots of failures along the way, has been related to public affairs, whether reporting on it or writing about it or running for office. So for me, it's been fun.
Great. Well,
and I imagine a number of people on this call are former students of mine who are wondering if I'm still alive.
Well, we can report that you are very much. Well, let's talk about your book, the Politics, the Starter Kit. And the only criticism I'll make, Jim, is you didn't write this book 40 years ago. What happened? Because let's talk a little bit about the impetus, because it is, to me, a wonderfully practical primer on how to start. And I've often observed that the gap, and particularly in political science, between the practitioner and the academic is wildly broad. And a lot of people probably at U of I or SIU, young people who want to start a career in politics and government, I mean, they don't even know where do you start. And that is, I think, the impetus for this book.
Exactly. And I wish I had read the book when I was getting started in my interest in politics and government. And so that's why I wrote it. Political science books, and political scientists are very smart people. They talk about the structure and the dynamics, but I don't see any of us talking about what you just said, how to get involved, how to do this. And so if I had had this book when I was running for office, by the way, I knew none of this when I decided to run for the House at age 24 back in 1966. I might have won that election because it was very close. And so if this can be helpful, great. About 1 million students take Intro to American Government every year in the United States. It's one of the basic courses. And if I can get this in front of a significant number, that might cause some of them to take a look into politics who might not have done so otherwise. And we certainly need good, thoughtful, public service-oriented people playing in the game of politics.
Jim, let me read a sentence or two from your book, because it seems to me this is sort of the premise of your entire book. You say, politics is indeed a craft, like carpentry or plumbing, learned through study and practice. And the political ladder is not that tall. There are only 3 basic steps on the ladder, from elected school board to the US presidency. Talk about this, politics as just a kind of a learned profession.
When you jump into politics, you you're just kind of foundering at first, and then you appreciate that there are other people in the pool with you, and that it's the key is to draw upon those people and to understand them and where they're coming from, which often isn't exactly what they say, but what they mean. And so you learn by experience. First time I ran, I learned how to run. And so 2 years later, I ran and was much more effective at running. So and I'm even more effective today. Effective might not be the right word. I am more, I think, cognizant of how to play the game because I played the game. It's not neuroscience, but it's not simple either. You have to have a sophisticated understanding of other people and what motivates them. And if you can do that, you can often entice them to your point of view because maybe you have figured out there's something of benefit to them in pursuing your objective. So it's a stimulating game, and the people who play it love it. That's why we have octogenarians who won't drop out. They love the game. And that's important. There's nothing wrong with that.
Jim, you write in kind of a fun, wry way about kind of the unending argument about which level of government is most important. And you say, it depends on the situation. And you write, when sewage is backing up in your basement because of a snafu with underground municipal plumbing, which is more important to the homeowner at the time, your city government or relations with China?
They're all important. Every level is important. That's why we have the different levels.
Right. I love the way you frame that. Well, so let's plunge in. So how do you start in politics? And one of the things that you argue is, one of the kind of points of entry is just volunteering, just showing up to the local party organization and volunteering to do work. I mean, you note that volunteers, volunteers oftentimes mean to do well, but oftentimes in crunch time, they kind of disappear. And, you might have 10% of your volunteers who are really 100% reliable. But just talk about that, about just entering and volunteering both at kind of local political things, but also and talk a little bit about becoming connected to your community and joining like local civics groups and become, more insinuated in your community.
I think there are more opportunities than ever to become involved in politics because political party organizations have declined so significantly and yet are part of the process today. So in many counties, there are lots of openings for precinct committeeman, committeewoman, precinct captain, as it's called in Cook County. And you can just go to the county chair of your party and say, I'd like to be a precinct committeeman, or maybe you have to run for it, but often there are opportunities, and you help the county chair, who may or may not be important in the larger scheme of things, by working in volunteering in a campaign, doing whatever he asks, maybe driving a candidate to some event or going door to door. And he or she will appreciate it and get you involved in something more. It's as simple as that, but you have to make the effort. A lot of people volunteer, and then when they're asked to do something, they, oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy that day. Well, that's the end of your activity in politics. In other words, when you say you want to volunteer, you have to be there to help when it's needed.
Yeah. Jim, I had an interesting experience. I taught a class on Congress, and my final paper assignment was to ask my students to stipulate that they're 22 and that in 10 years they want to run for office. They want to run for Congress. So what would they do in that decade to prepare both to become more electorally viable, but also substantively viable? And one of the things that was striking is a number of them had said to me that they would move to a different community where they thought they would be more politically viable. Is that just kind of a feature of our polarized world where people just think, that you literally almost have to pick a community where you think you might get a hearing?
Unfortunately, we are segregating ourselves by economics and social class, and that affects the partisan makeup of a community. So there probably is something to that. But to answer your question about what to do in the interim 10 years, I would say a couple of things. One, develop a career independent of politics, or that you can fall back on if you aren't successful should you pursue politics, and because politics is a fickle game and you don't control all the variables, and therefore even if you're the world's best candidate, you may not win. And so have a backup plan. And then second, I would say, as I had a few minutes ago, just become involved. I mean, people in politics like people who are willing to help them in their game, and they'll reciprocate. That's another important thing. Reciprocate. It's a game of reciprocity. If I help you, you are more likely to help me, and so those are basics in the game.
Right. Well, one thing you say, Jim, is, as you're thinking about running for office, to be patient, but don't be too patient. And you write, as you consider running for office, you will often be counseled by party leaders to, quote, wait your turn. I found out that one's turn never seems to arrive as others jump in ahead of you. The perfect time rarely comes along. Talk about that sense of not going too soon, but also not waiting too long, and having others, step forward when maybe you might have. Is this totally kind of an instinctive thing, or do you think people should just kind of err on the side of boldness and taking the plunge?
It depends on the personality as to whether one should err on the side of boldness. Some people are in a hurry to get involved and want to be aggressive about it. Others are more deliberate. So there are different approaches, and you can't set the table exactly the way you want it. And so you have to roll with the punches, and you can't be certain of the outcomes. If somebody living in South Dakota is going to have a better chance of becoming a United States senator than somebody living in California. I mean, the setting and the environment all play a part in that, but it shouldn't diminish one's interest in having a go at it if one is interested. And by the way, running for office is not the only way to become involved. You can become an assistant to somebody who likes to be out front as the candidate. You can become a staff member for a candidate and a government official. So there are many ways to play the game, but I think the important thing is to appreciate that it is a serious substantive game about making policy that affects all of us. I think that's why lawyers often are interested in politics. They make private policy for their clients and probably think, from what they know in their training, that they can play a part in making public policy. So the game it's not a simple construct, and it's not the same for everybody.
Right. Well, you're also talking about just as a candidate or as a person goes forward, and let's say this is an elective office, you say you must be willing to ask people for their help and money. I found this excruciatingly hard to do as a 24-year-old candidate for the Illinois legislature, but somehow I did it. Talk about that. I mean, I guess it connected to the broader point that you make quite frequently in your book, Jim, is that politics is a team game. I mean, there may be one candidate, but there are people behind him or her, doing a lot of the important critical work. But for someone who decides to put themselves out front, just the need to be to ask for help. And even though a lot of us find that really difficult.
A lot of it has to do with self-confidence. And when you start, you maybe have less self-confidence than you do later on. I have a perfect example, Jack. A friend of ours, Ray, mutual friend of ours, Ray LaHood, and I paid a call recently on a well-to-do company executive where we were seeking money for a project up here in my territory, Starved Rock Country. And the fellow said, well, what do you need? 10,000? 20,000? Ray said, looked him in the guy and said, we need 100,000. And the guy said to his assistant, Olivia, write out a check for 100,000. Afterwards, over lunch, I talked with Ray and I said, when you and I were young candidates, would you have done that? Or didn't it scare the devil out of you to ask people for money? He said, oh, I hated to ask people for money. So you see, over a career, you develop a sense that asking people for money shows respect for them, because it says, I know you have the worth to do this. And if you want to say, no or half of what you asked for, that's fine. And you go on to the next person. I've known some people who are very good at asking for money because they believe in themselves. Chuck Percy was president of a major company in the U.S., who was a U.S. senator. Well, he loved to ask people for money. It was a challenge for him. So that's one aspect of it. And people, if people believe in you, they will support you, but you have to convince them that you have something worthy to offer.
Right. Well, you talk about like launching a campaign, and you write you must have a written campaign plan. It doesn't have to be fancy. It does have to set forth a strategy by which you can win. It should be followed until it has to be changed. And so talk about that, just sort of the mechanics of a plan, which is extraordinarily practical. How many votes do I need to win? How much money do I need to raise? How much time do I have? Talk about that, just the mechanics of assembling a plan that guides your efforts.
You just have to, it's almost like a business plan. As you say, can be simple, objectives, goals, resources needed, how to get there. I don't think I had a campaign plan when I first ran for office, and maybe not even the time I won the House. And yet, when I was running a U.S. Senate campaign, a successful one, we had a quite elaborate plan. And the better the plan, the more effective the use of resources and of your time, and thus the more likely you are to be successful. I don't want to overuse this term game, but that's what life is. It's a game. We all have objectives, goals. There are other players. There's an arena in which to play the game. One arena for this candidate is different from another arena in another state or for another office. And you just have to stand back and assess your resources, your needs, the likely approach of your opponents, and it's a good process to write a plan. It helps you in your larger thinking.
Jim, you also say, you're talking about campaigning. You say campaigning can be fun or excruciating, generally both. Talk about the fun and also the excruciating of campaigning.
Let's see. Well, losing is excruciating, but it's not the end of the game, to overuse that term. Excruciating in the sense that, maybe it hasn't been that excruciating for me. I'm trying to come up with illustrations.
I mean, but just like the notion of knocking on a door and the door being slammed and just not being listened to, but as you point out, most people, if you go door to door, will treat you respectfully if you approach them in a respectful way.
Yeah, that brings to mind that in campaigning, 90% or more of the people you run into are good, positive people and are willing to listen to you. And there are going to be some asses out there. And again, it comes down to one's self-confidence. And that's a psychology on which I'm not the world's foremost expert, but the more self-confidence you develop, not that you will always win, but that what you're doing is important and you are capable of projecting yourself to that objective, the more confidence you have, the less excruciating it becomes, because you don't feel hurt by somebody who takes you to task in an unfair way.
Well, one thing you talk about, Jim, is just, oftentimes when you're campaigning for office, there are the candidate forums in which, everyone is given a limited amount of time. And one of your rules is have a 3-minute stump speech in which you say, who you are, why you're running, et cetera. Talk about, and also you make the point that it's oftentimes most effective when it's both brief and self-deprecating.
Yeah. if you're given a limit of 5 minutes on a stage where there are 12 other candidates who all want to talk, and your best counsel from me is take 3 minutes instead of 5. And so that kind of sense is important. Where were you going with that? I lost my train of thought. A good answer.
Just the importance of having kind of a brief statement of who you are, what you're doing, and why, as opposed to maybe the 25-minute policy oration about, mine reclamation or something. Just the need to be able to summarize your message in a kind of clear, succinct way, in forums in which people are interested but not that interested, and brevity.
Okay, yeah. Well, that gets back to understanding people. Don't say in the format you want to proceed or offer, but think of the audience. If it's a big audience that is looking at 12 other candidates to speak, they're going to want it brief. They're going to want the bottom line. On the other hand, if it's a group of policy wonks, they're going to want that 25-minute talk. So here again, keep in mind your audience and what they need and what they want, rather than what you want to tell them. I know some folks who just can't stand up without going on endlessly because they think they're important and what they have to say is important. And it might be, but it won't work if the audience isn't in tune with your approach.
Jim, I was thinking of a corollary to your, I think your 3-minute template is really good. And I was thinking of a corollary in which I know a diplomat who says that diplomacy is the art of the 45-second conversation. And by that, he means that, he would, during his time in diplomacy, would be going to many, many receptions, and both host and attendee, as a host and attendee. And he said, particularly if you're hosting something, you cannot talk to, if you have about 45 people there, you cannot linger for long, meandering conversations. No, you have to do more than just say hello. And so, he just said kind of 45 seconds would allow him to acknowledge someone, describe something they had done together recently, what they might be doing, in the future. Just showing that this person had been actually heard and seen. And it strikes me that that's sort of, when you're campaigning in politics, that probably isn't a bad rule either.
Yeah, it's a good rule. Show respect for the person you're talking to by relating to him or her some way, by noting something about the other person and his accomplishment or her activities.
Well, Jim, you have a wonderful chapter on becoming a successful lawmaker. And one of the things I took away from that is just the importance of sort of knowing what you're trying to accomplish, and also what your skills are, and using those to kind of frame how the issues you pursue and just kind of the legislative style you adopt. Talk about that, if you would.
The legislative style one adopts, let's see, the legislator has to have a plan, much like a campaign plan, because you should go into office wanting to accomplish certain things, whether they're for your district or a broad public policy. And so you develop a plan for accomplishing a policy objective. You develop a plan for increasing your influence within the legislative process. I don't know where to go with that, Jack. In other words.
So, I think one thing that I took away, Jim, was that, if, for example, you are this, a super detail-oriented person, that maybe you could devote your time to being, I think there's like a paradigm of kind of the craftsman who works in committees. I mean, if you have, your interests are wider ranging, but not deep, that you would find maybe a different set of issues. So just kind of judging, the issues you pursue to some extent, obviously the interests of your district, but also what your skill set is.
Yeah. As I quote James David Barber, a well-known political scientist from my era of graduate school, he points out in a study of the Connecticut legislature that there are different roles that legislators play, and that's what you have prompted me on here. Some are deal makers who enjoy the game of putting legislators together to come up with a majority for a controversial piece of legislation. Others enjoy becoming policy experts in education or in healthcare, and in developing that expertise so that maybe not a major piece of legislation, but instead, when bills related to healthcare come up, other legislators defer to that person and that healthcare expert and ask for counsel as to whether whether the legislation is good or not, and that sort of thing. So there are different roles to play, and most legislators are not full-time, and so they can't fulfill every role. So play to your strengths and what gives you satisfaction.
Yeah. Jim, as you know, I was a congressional reporter for a number of years, and this plays off this theme. I think of a lot about what I call the Evan Bayh complex. And Senator Bayh was a senator from Indiana. He actually was the son of a senator, and at a very young age became elected Indiana Secretary of State, served 2 terms, was governor, maybe in his early 40s, 2 terms, was a senator, I think for 2 or 3 terms. And I mean, smart guy, nice person, et cetera. But as I watched him in Congress over the years, he never seemed to have any influence. He never seemed to be kind of at the center of action. And there was a handful of others who were just very different. I remember Lindsey Graham before he kind of took a different turn. But, as he started as a senator, I mean, he was in the middle of everything. I mean, one of the things he embraced John McCain as a mentor, and McCain was generous and kind of pulled him into things. But it was just so striking to me that, one person who's probably on paper was more impressive, every bit as smart, in an academic sense, was relatively ineffectual. And another person, with maybe the same skill set was just, in the middle of everything and just having kind of an influence that was disproportionate than what he should. And so it just made me think about politics as both a learned craft, but also, to some extent, an instinctive craft as well.
I think you're absolutely right. I think your Paul Simon Institute and the namesake is a good illustration of a role that he played very importantly. That is, he was never a member of the Senate Club. He was never, a buddy of Richard Russell and the old Southerners, but and they probably thought he was goody two shoes. But he took his enthusiasm, actually, and his commitment to certain issues in such a way that he was able to have influence outside the club. And there are probably people in the club who weren't very bright in an intellectual sense, but they were very bright in terms of understanding people and how to put things together. Now, Hubert Humphrey would be another illustration of the Paul Simon type. Very intensely enthusiastic about good government issues, but not part of the club and consciously not part of the club.
Another senator who fascinates me is Paul Douglas from Illinois, who was, this Ph.D. professor at University of Chicago, extraordinarily smart intellectually, and very passionately committed, and was, and was a significant legislator. But when it came to putting civil rights legislation, I think Douglas played a really important role. But then also you had Everett Dirksen, also from Illinois, who entered the fray, and he was the wheeler dealer. He was, relatively late to the civil rights cause, but then became indispensable in kind of working with Southern Democrats to pull together, to at least have them back off some of their fierce opposition and kind of put together the final package. So in my class on statesmanship, I do kind of a companion class on Paul Douglas and Everett Dirksen, is just very, very different approaches to legislating and statesmanship.
Make different contributions to the overall process and to the overall product. Dirksen, I'll bet Dirksen relished the acclaim he received for taking a position that was probably initially uncomfortable for him, and certainly for the Republican colleagues whom he was able to bring along to vote for the civil rights legislation. And that gets back to our original conversation about what's this game all about, and why is it interesting and fun and rewarding, and why is it sometimes excruciating? Hubert Humphrey had a real come down when he had to go along with Lyndon Johnson on the Vietnam War in order for Humphrey to become a presidential candidate. And so it's a boisterous game, if I'm using those words right, with fun challenges and sometimes defeats.
Well, Jim, let's talk a little bit about government management, because you, on three occasions, were a cabinet director. And you said, I think at least several of the occasions, you were kind of brought in to kind of fix an agency, and you said you were kind of brought in and given relatively little bit of time, and it wasn't always, the easiest thing to do. But I love this quote. You're quoting a 19th century British journalist who said, "The job of a minister is not to run his ministry, but to see that it runs well." And talk about that as kind of a management impetus or impulse to make sure that the enterprise is working well, but not necessarily being the one who's doing the day-to-day, logistics.
Here again, you have to understand yourself and your role, and you have to understand the agency of which you are going to be a part, and appreciate that you are not going to run that agency. The agency's people were there before you, and they're going to be there after you. They're going to think of you as the new kid on the block, no matter how long you're there. And so if you're going to maximize your effectiveness, you have to make it clear to your agency's top people that you are there to help them, and in turn you hope they will help you, because you have a role somewhere between the executive office and their agency. And once again, it's a team sport, and you can go in and say, I'm in charge and this is the way it's going to be done, and nothing's going to happen. You know what I mean? Or you can go in and say, look, what are your goals? Here are my goals. Where are we in sync? And let's develop a strategy for achieving them. And ideally, that strategy will be useful to my boss, who appointed me to come over to this agency. And again, that can be a rewarding challenge. It isn't sexy, but it's about how to work with people effectively.
Well, Jim, in your book, you also say when you were a state agency director, a phrase that you heard more than a few times was, "I'm sorry, director, but we just can't do that." It doesn't just apply, by the way, to state government. It has some applications in the university world. I know you know.
Yeah.
I've heard that phrase about a couple hundred times during my tenure here. So,
yeah, and your university setting is not that much different from a major agency of government. It's a bureaucracy of a sort, and that's not a bad thing. It's just a bureaucracy means a gathering of people who are there for a long haul and who develop objectives that might be different from those of the leader of the agency. And if you're a major state bureaucrat, you sometimes well, if you're a major state bureaucrat, you come to see things you want to achieve for the agency and the agency's clients, but you appreciate you're not the decision maker. And so you have to develop a strategy as a bureaucrat for how you're going to achieve your objectives within the context of not being the decision maker. So sometimes what you do is say, oh, I'm sorry, director, that what you want done can't be done. And that frustrates everybody, of course. So again, the agency director has to see the agency through the people who've been there a long time and how they have developed their perspectives on what should be done, and see where he or she, the agency director, can work with those people to the benefit of everybody. It's not easy, and it can be frustrating. I think FDR, as president, was frustrated with the State Department, which was then in the old executive office building, and he'd issue a directive and nothing had happened. He'd issue another directive and nothing would happen. And so, according to the story I heard, one day he had his assistant wheel him over into the old executive building, into some long corridor with lots of file cabinets, and he just started pulling file cabinets out onto the floor, dashing all sorts of papers. And so in his frustration, and that's a part of leading a large agency, figuring out how to get things done.
Yeah. Well, just a quick aside, Mike Lawrence, one of my predecessors, so I know you know quite well, one of the pieces of advice he gave me prior to taking this job was he said, you know, there are going to be procedures that make absolutely no sense to you and it can drive you crazy. But what you need to do is figure out what it is you want to do and then find people who will help you do it. And do not get yourself paralyzed by the kind of the procedural morass that might be in front of you.
Yeah. And that brings to mind something I think I observed in the book, and that is that in the governor's office, or this would be the president's office or big city mayor's office, there are hotshot young staffers who are in and outers, who are helping their elected official. And from your position in an agency, you need to develop good relationships with them. And that's, I think, part of what Mike was saying, so that they will work with you rather than simply dictate to you and make life miserable for you.
Right. Well, let's talk about lobbying. And you write rather, you say, I was a terrible lobbyist. The game is not for everyone. And you say lobbying is effectively pure advocacy. You're a salesman. Talk about lobbying and what makes a good lobbyist.
Well, a good lobbyist is someone who enjoys advocating. Probably a good salesman would be a good lobbyist, because he or she comes to believe or takes on the role of believing deeply in the policy, objective, or whatever of his or her client. That is critical. And then the lobbyist must come to understand, as we've said several times in this conversation, the people with whom he or she is dealing, whether it's a legislator or a legislative staffer or media, must understand where they are coming from in order to communicate with them most effectively. And the best lobbyists also are helpful to other people. I think I've mentioned a couple of times in the book the importance of helping others, because they are struggling with their own objectives. And if you can be helpful to them without compromising yourself, they're going to be more likely to reciprocate when they can. And so the good lobbyist has an exquisite understanding of the people with whom he or she is dealing. And for example, I point out to one lobbyist who said, now and then I counsel my legislative friends to vote against my company's position because it would hurt them in their district to do so. And I have bigger fish to fry in the long-term scheme of things in which I'll need them. You're bringing up all of the things that make politics fun. That is the challenge of a very complicated chessboard in which you're trying to get in a position where you can make a move, and I'm not a chess player, and you can block others from doing things you don't want, all of which takes fascinating interpersonal relations and a fund of credits that one can draw on. Debits and credits is another term I use in the book. The more credits you can build up with somebody, the more you can go to him or her and ask for payback of some of the credits you've put. And I don't mean that in a corrupt way, which is there are legitimate things you can do to help.
Well, Jim, I love that you were very actually pithy about a good lobbyist. You said a good lobbyist provides the right information in the right format to the right people at the right time, which I think, as you're saying, is both a kind of intellectual and also an intuitive exercise, and strategic and tactical. And that's just sort of the complex mix of politics. Jim, I want to talk a little bit about something that I know is really significant to you, is just Illinois' reputation as kind of this culture of corruption. The story is well known to people here. And you have really a fascinating chapter on ethics. And you make the point that very few people enter politics with the intention of being unethical. But you also say people enter politics rather blindly. They assume distinctions are clear, like black and white, but politics is largely cast in gray hues. Talk about that.
Well, in gray hues, obviously you're not going to take a bribe, but there are ways in which you can be helpful to someone that might not be illegal. Well, you can be helpful to someone without doing something illegal. I use in the chapter on the legislator, giving a vote to somebody in committee to get his bill out of committee. That's standard operating procedure. Well, that doesn't, that may generate a small credit for you with the legislator that you can draw upon later. But it hurts the process because it loads the floor up with legislation that takes too much time of the busy legislators. But in politics, let's see, it's cast in gray hues because you want to be helpful to people, but you don't want to do anything illegal or that would embarrass you, possibly. And so you have to weigh every decision in terms of, is this a good decision? Is it ethical? Am I getting anything that might be seen as personal gain at public expense out of it? And so I suggest in that chapter that it's important to have a second opinion conscience. And I have in my own mind our friend Mike Lawrence. If I were in politics today and there were some question I had about whether something was appropriate, ethical, or on the bounds, I'd go to Mike and say, how do you see this? And that can be helpful to one in his own decision making, because you don't necessarily see all of the ramifications of a decision. And in politics, you're making decisions at well, you're making hundreds of decisions a day, really, during the legislative session on various matters, not just on voting on bills. So you don't have time to give a lot of thought to whether this way of helping somebody might generate something of value to you. I use an illustration in the book of my awarding a University of Illinois scholarship to the son of a prominent family in my district, and on their contention that he had been denied admission to the University of Illinois and unfairly, and that my award of the scholarship, which was worth a lot of money, would automatically give him admission to the university, which it did in that period. And in retrospect, somebody had to defend me for that decision among her friends, because they thought it was just done to help this prominent family, which might in turn help me with a campaign contribution down the line, something I had never thought about. But the fact that it caused my dear friend to have to defend me suggests that it was certainly a gray area, and maybe on another day, I would have said, no, I can't help you with the scholarship. I can't help you with the scholarship.
Well, Jim, I think the context, and it's to me quite interesting, is back in the day, in the last, probably when you were in the General Assembly, members of the General Assembly were allowed to award a couple scholarships, full scholarships to Illinois public universities, and there was no clear criteria by which they gave that award. So, do you do it just kind of, instinctively and subjectively, or do you have a special panel of, people in your district? I mean, it was always left vague how, as I understand it, how those scholarships would be dispensed. And so it led itself to people, making judgment calls that could be called into question about, or just giving it to campaign contributors or supporters,
yeah,
whatever.
Exactly. And some legislators did create panels, but in my era, which was now 50 some years ago, people didn't think about those constraints or those ways of going about making sure the awards were to the most deserving person. And so in my era, that is an illustration of a gray area. And if you don't have a second conscience like a Mike Lawrence, I know, would have said, Jim, you don't want to give that scholarship out to that family because he's not the most deserving. So that would have been helpful to me. And I think in retrospect, I am more sensitive. So in a sense, what this little book does is try to make students appreciate, students and interns. I would hope anybody listening to this still would see about making sure that interns get copies of this, because it gives them an introduction and maybe a leg up. It doesn't answer all questions. It's a slender book, but it causes them to think, just as I would now think differently about that scholarship award than I did without thinking decades ago.
Right. Jimmy, you mentioned earlier that your first race you lost, and I was actually attended an Edgar Fellows event last week to about the Simon Edgar Award, and it was interesting. Governor Edgar was introducing our friend Ray LaHood and mentioned that both Ray and he lost their first races. Ray was a state rep appointed in the Quad Cities and lost, I think it was in '82. Governor Edgar was running for state rep the first time in the early '70s and lost. And both of them kind of commented that they learned an awful lot from those losses. And then as things lined up, those losses proved to be fortuitous for their careers. So, I mean, one thing you've already said is just the practicality of having, if you lose a race, a way to get, pay your rent or something. So something to fall back on. But reflect for a second on just, on the power of defeat, or how defeat can be used to kind of sharpen your work and improve your game.
Or how victory could be a problem later on. People say, well, Jim, if you had won the race for lieutenant governor way back in 1972, you would have become governor. And I say, yeah, and I might have ended up in jail, because I was a very naive, innocent young legislator at a time when politics was rough and tumble, and there were lots of exchanges of things of value for advances and for votes and that sort of thing. And at the time, the federal government was becoming more aggressive in pursuing corruption. So I'm not saying I would have been corrupt or would have ended up in jail, but one never knows where a path will take one. And so, defeat shouldn't be seen as failure. You think of socialist leaders who faced defeat throughout the early 1900s in the U.S., but who basically were advocating for things the Democratic Party picked up later, Social Security and Medicare. So how do you measure defeat? It's not in losing an office, it's in whether you are contributing, whether in the effort that results in defeat, or whether the defeat leads to opportunities that you hadn't thought about. If you run a good race and are defeated, people may say, this guy or this lady has real potential. We're going to get behind that person for the future in another activity. I think of the techies in California. Failure is seen as a positive, not as a negative. If you haven't failed, you really haven't tried hard, because it's a very problematic, world in which their experiments and their ventures go forward. So you don't want to fail, but you shouldn't use failure as an excuse for dropping out or losing your zeal to do good things.
Okay, great. Jim, we have two questions that have been emailed in, and I'll pose those, and then we can wrap up. The first question is, what are the best ways for retired people with limited means and available time to become involved in politics and government to make a contribution? So I guess that's the other end of the spectrum. But for people who have retired but still want to contribute to their communities and their government, what could or should they do?
That's a wonderful question, and it should be developed or plumbed more deeply than we're going to be able to do it today, because it's such a vast swath of the public today, and with such great skills and experience. So I would say the ways to be involved are through participation. Become a precinct committeeman and have a voice in the Democratic or Republican Central Committee of your county. Obviously become more active than you might have been earlier in civic and civic and social groups, the Rotary, and groups that are struggling now for membership. but which do great work. Writing is another way to do so. One's observations can be helpful because they're based on experience. That may suggest offering to become involved in a campaign and provide research assistance or policy development of ideas that would be valuable to the candidate and on which the retiree has significant experience. So there are lots of ways, and it's an excellent question. I'll be very quick. I think an untapped resource in America is the coffee klatch. There are millions of regular coffee klatches at which smart men and women sit around and gossip. And if they could spend 10 minutes per week focusing on an issue of public interest, they might, and forwarded those to a central place, those thoughts might be of value. Others would say, oh, that's just going to be, you're just going to get BS. But when people are asked to do something significant or serious or constructive, I think people enjoy that opportunity. Let me stop there.
Well, Jim, that would be a wonderful column for you to write. I love your columns, so that might be something that you could advance. Another question is, and you and I have talked a lot about the mood in Illinois, the future of Illinois, and so forth. But one question asks, what is your sense of the mood in Illinois outside the Chicago metropolitan area? What is the state of major secondary cities? Aurora, Naperville, Peoria, Rockford, Springfield, Decatur, Rock Island, Galesburg. What do you think, Jim?
I think it's challenging for mid-sized cities and for rural America. We already know that rural America is struggling. I think the cities that are within the penumbra of a metropolitan area like Chicago, that is Aurora, Naperville, probably have very strong futures if they develop them effectively, because they're part of a huge market. They have a lot of smart people living in their communities. They're connected. Whereas, down in your territory in Southern Illinois and mine in Western Illinois, we're less connected, and we have seen people leave. Caterpillar left Peoria, for example. ADM left Decatur, and that is a drain on the intellectual and entrepreneurial resources of a community. So it's going to be challenging, but some are saying that mid-sized cities are going to bounce back because young people want some action, but they don't want New York City. And so it's probably up to these communities to figure out what people want and whether and how they can provide it. But let me use it as a springboard to talk briefly about an essay I'm working on now that I'm tentatively titling, "Come to Illinois, We're Getting Warmer." And my point is a billboard campaign. Come to Illinois, we're getting warmer. We have oodles of water, and we're becoming less corrupt. Now, I think that's a terrific theme that would have to, and you can build upon it, and I would do so if you had a minute. But the point is, we have great strengths as a state that we don't appreciate and the world doesn't appreciate, and we're not marketing them. And we lack the confidence to smile at ourselves. Texas, which has its own problems, but is a darling for economic development, came up with a great slogan, "Don't mess with Texas." And it spoke to the pride of Texas, and it was for the state transportation department, which had too much rubbish along the road. As a result of that campaign, "Don't mess with Texas," with Willie Nelson on a billboard, rubbish on the side of the road went down dramatically. Well, anyway, my bottom line is Illinois has tremendous strengths. If you have 2 seconds, Jim Schultz of Effingham said in the 6 R's that are critical to economic development: rails, runways, rivers, roads, research, routers. In each of them, Illinois is arguably among the top 3 states in the nation. And we're in the middle of the world's largest market, and we do have oodles of water. So there are lots of strengths that we somehow aren't communicating to the larger world. And as I say, Texas, the darling right now of economic development. Would you want to live there? How fast is it drying up and heating up? Illinois ranks 11th in reading scores, Texas 41st. So all states have problems, but we see all my successful friends bemoan Illinois and badmouth it and say they're going to leave, and some do. And yet I think the state overall, and this would include the mid-sized cities, have strengths that we aren't marketing, and we have problems. There's no getting around that. But I think the problems can be addressed, but that's going to take some leadership that is not on the horizon, if you will. In other words, the major CEOs that 50 years ago spent a lot of time making Illinois a good, a prosperous state, they're now CEOs of global corporations. They don't have time for Illinois. So who's going to fill that void? Well, as you know, I have been beating on Jim Edgar to take his wonderful Edgar Fellows program and somehow stimulate some of those 400 leaders to organize informally or in some way to take on the tough problems. And so and that suggests we have a lot of potential there. I mean, lots of smart people want to become Edgar Fellows. And that suggests there is leadership potential that maybe isn't being harnessed, may not be the right word, isn't being stimulated to take on those leadership challenges.
Jim, it's always a pleasure talking. You and I love Illinois and love talking about the state and are trying to find ways to help make it better. And one major contribution you're making right now is this book here, Politics, the Starter Kit. And let me ask you finally, how can people get a copy of this? How, whether it's a student or a parent or grandparent who wants to give it to their children, how do they get it?
Amazon, Barnes and Noble.
Okay.
It's only $12 on for the printed edition because it's a slender book. Or $2.99 for an ebook, so it's accessible. And I would hope anybody still listening would make sure that interns, whether governmental or private association or whatever, whom they know, be introduced to the book. Not that it answers all their questions, but it might intrigue them into a closer look at politics and government, as we certainly need a strong cohort of young people going into that world.
Well, Jim, you've persuaded me that we will get a bunch of copies of these and give it to our interns before they go to Springfield, and our student workers and others here to really get grounded in some of the practical elements of entering the political profession and conducting themselves honorably and in a way that helps our republic. So, Jim, thank you so much. I look forward to keeping in touch, and it's been great to talk.
Thanks a lot, Jack. It was good to be with you.
Thank you. And thanks to all you for watching another edition of our show, Illinois Authors. We will have this video on our website in the coming days. Please show it to family and friends. Thanks for supporting the Institute. Thank you for keeping the memory of Paul Simon alive and well. Thanks so much.